Hello there, everyone. Welcome to our live Q&A with TestOil today. I'm so happy you all could join us. Today we'll be covering utilizing coolant analysis in your condition monitoring program. My name is Heather Versillo, and I'm here with Evan Zabowski. A little bit about me first. I'm going to be moderating today's event, so if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to put them in the comment section, and I'll be there to either ask your questions or help you get any technical difficulties answered. A little bit about me. I've been with TestOil for a little over 10 years now in a variety of roles. I started out on the technical side with giving our customers recommendations based on their oil analysis reports and coolant here and there as well. From that point, I've actually moved into the marketing realm of the world, which has been really great for my personality since I really enjoy working with people. So I get to marry that technical and creative aspects together. So with that, Evan, I'll let you introduce yourself as well.
I'm Evan Zabowski. I am the Senior Technical Advisor here at TestOil and mostly responsible for giving our customers training classes, some of those relating to certifications, but as well as predominantly being oil analysis. We've done some coolant testing classes as well, because I'm always interested in helping clients learn a little bit more and, of course, become more useful at their jobs.
Yep, and Evan is really fantastic at this as well. So without further ado, we'll get started since we only really have 20 to 30 minutes together today. So we did receive a number of questions ahead of time, but like I mentioned, please feel free to throw any of your questions or situations in the comments, and we'd love to help you through those while we're live. But if you can't make today, there'll be a recording, or if you have to cut out early, and I'll make sure everybody gets that. All right, so without further ado, Evan, the first question that I happen to receive for coolant analysis is actually a really great one. I think this was maybe an internal one too, but why should you consider adding coolant analysis to your condition monitoring program? Which is a great question to kick us off today.
Yeah, well, that one's got kind of an easy answer in some ways, because the OEMs for the major engine manufacturers and some of even the coolant manufacturers give out various statistics ranging from about 40 to 60%. So let's just call it 50 and say that about 50% of engine downtime, maintenance costs, or repairs are related to the cooling system. So if you can buy into oil analysis as a useful tool for monitoring your engine's coolant analysis, undoubtedly is equally important and offers you a completely different perspective. So right there gives you, kind of a basis for it's worth doing. But the other side of it is that engine oil analysis can cover some pretty minor repairs, spot some pretty easy things to fix. And sometimes they only amount to a few $100s, whereas coolant analysis can quickly rack up into the thousands, tens of thousands of dollars for these big heavy-duty engines. So the return on investment, even though it may be only 50% of the problems, can sometimes be a higher ROI in the end.
Okay, that's great to know. So how similar is coolant analysis then to oil analysis?
Well, it's kind of similar and very different at the same time. It's similar in that the customer fills a little bottle, sends it to the lab, and gets back a report. So to them, it looks like it's pretty much the same thing. But in reality, all of the testing is completely different, except for one small test. The elemental spectroscopy that we use for oil analysis to detect wear metals, additives, and contaminants, we use that same test to measure some of the wear metals that we see in coolants, but almost all the other testing is completely different. And I guess the easiest way to look at it is with oil analysis, you're typically seeing both the health of the machine, so in that case an engine, and the health of the fluid from a certain perspective. Usually it's by measuring contaminants and some of the degradation that occurs. With coolant analysis, we're solely focused on the coolant. We're not really seeing anything about the engine itself, other than some of the things the coolant might impart to the engines, like cavitation, corrosion, things like this. But we're really focused on the coolant. So we're really measuring additive levels, inhibitors, things like this, degradation of the coolant, and then a lot of the contaminants that lead to those occurring a bit faster. So in many ways it's similar, and in other ways, it's completely different. Can't hear you.
Thank you very much there. So our next question is along the same lines, and they were asking if coolant sampling is like taking an oil sample.
Very similar, yeah. Again, small bottle, you just need to fill it. So it seems like it's pretty much the same. Generally with coolant, there's really only two sample locations you can go from. You can either go through the pressure cap, which does require that the engine is shut down and cooled down to a degree. So that's unlike, say, oil samples, which are typically done while it's running if possible. But the other perspective is we can take samples from the drain, which you could accomplish while it's running, as long as you have a way of metering the pressure. But the basics are the same. You wipe the area first, you flush it really well to get a representative sample, you fill the bottle, cap it immediately to prevent contamination from coming in. All those other small steps are pretty much the same, but you're rather limited to where you can take a coolant sample because there's just not a lot of easy ways to access the coolant, short of pretty much going straight to the radiator.
Okay. So great. And then speaking of pulling the oil sample, so kind of the next step in the process is what kind of tests do you typically run on coolant samples?
Well, a standard package includes a few key tests, like we do refractive index, which gives us your coolant concentration, so how much glycol is in there, as well as your boiling point and your freeze point. That's followed by pH and conductivity, which measure, of course, the alkalinity of the coolant. We don't want to see it getting acidic. And the conductivity helps us understand whether or not we think there's going to be high degrees of corrosion going on in there. From there, there's a few other minor additive type tests that we can do. But when you get the advanced coolant testing, you get all that plus what we call ion chromatography, which measures some contaminants, some degradation byproducts, and some of the additives or inhibitors, as you might want to call them. And we do high pressure liquid chromatography, which measures a whole bunch of different additives that are specific to the long life coolants, predominantly found in heavy duty engines. And as well, we do something called the supplemental coolant additive, or SCA number, which again is very useful for people who are using extended life coolants and are doping them as they use them and trying to keep them in service for as long as possible. So there's a bit more when it comes to the advanced testing, and like I said, it's generally targeted towards those long life heavy duty coolants.
Okay, perfect. And so when we do coolant analysis, what are the most common problems that are detected?
Most commonly, if people are not buying premix, meaning they buy the glycol concentrate and then they mix it themselves, the two biggest things that we find are either they didn't get the mix ratio right, and that affects just about all the properties in a negative way, or they use something like tap water, which is not recommended, and they introduce a lot of different contaminants to the coolant, which lead to problems like scale. Now, assuming they've bought premixed and you're going to avoid those particular problems, probably the next most common thing that we see is either mixing of coolants, which means that you have more than one coolant on site and you just happen to top up a system or fill a system with the wrong one. And many OEMs are pretty strict about this because they want to see certain additive chemistries. And two things: one is using the wrong additive chemistry definitely voids your warranty, but may lead to some operational issues. But mixing of two coolants often creates some pretty negative synergies where you're going to have the coolants do things that they shouldn't be doing and not protecting your system the way they should. So even if you haven't voided your warranty, you're probably going to cause yourself some problems. So that's probably one of the more common ones that you'll see coming from, like I said, people who do happen to buy premix. But the last one would be from there, you do see when the coolant begins to degrade. So if you've been particularly hard on your coolant, running the engine a bit hotter than normal or whatever the case may be, if your coolant is suffering, coolant analysis will pick up on that real quick and let you know it's time to change the coolant.
So when we talk about these different problems then, out of curiosity, what are some of the common solutions?
Well, one of the solutions, of course, if you're getting the mix ratios wrong or using the wrong water, then obviously you have to either consider buying premix, which has the right water at the right ratio, problem solved. But if you have mixing of coolants, then one of the key things to do, of course, is try and rebalance it. So drain some coolant, get the right coolant in there, reduce yourself. Typically the number that they're expecting, the OEMs anyways, is less than 10% of the incorrect coolant is considered generally acceptable by most, not all. But if you can try and restore yourself back to the right coolant, everything should settle. And funnily enough, it's kind of the same solution when it comes to degradation, in that if you can't afford to completely change the coolant, don't want to take all that time, then you can, of course, top it up with some of the new fluid, the new coolant, and restore some of the properties. But if you have suffered significant degradation and or possibly wrong water, wrong mixtures, and there has been a buildup in your system, the next answer is you're going to have to perform a flush. And you're going to have to get in there with a cleaning agent, run it around, get everything cleaned up, cleaned out, rinsed, and then, of course, refilled with new coolant. So it becomes a much bigger process. And that's one of the best reasons to use coolant analysis, is to hopefully catch that at its earliest and avoid going all the way down until you have to do the major repair.
Right, exactly. So when we're talking about these different issues, sometimes we have issues because different formulations are mixed. And can coolant analysis tell us when we have different formulations that have become mixed? And if so, what tests should we be looking at for this information?
Well, the key ones are found in the advanced testing. Your ion chromatography and your high pressure liquid chromatography measured the different additives. And that's what's most likely to change in an obvious way to tell you you've got two coolants mixed. If it is like mixing, say, conventional coolant with a long life coolant, you could detect that as easily as looking at the pH. You might even see that with one of the simple additive tests. But if you really pay attention to your key additives, your nitrate, your nitrite, your molybdate, those change radically from one formulation to another. And one of the two that we focus on is silicates, and the second one is phosphates. Those two in particular are what create the three different, what we call groups of coolants out there. There's your conventional coolants, which have both silicates and phosphates, your organic acid technologies, which have neither of those, and then your hybrid or your nitrate organic acid technology ones, which only have very low levels of them. So those are the key ones to kind of pay attention to. And if you see something that shouldn't be there, or see a significant drop in something that should be there, then that's usually the most easily identified way of saying, hey, something's been mixed in here. But I mean, and this is, it's kind of the running joke with coolants is sort of the easy answer is it's the color too, right? And that's why they're formulated in about 16 different colors, so that if you do mix them, you will see a difference in color, and they don't try and make similar coolants similar colors. So if you're supposed to be using red and it looks blue, well, there's your first clue, right?
Right, exactly. All right. And I think one point of confusion for a lot of people is how often they should be testing coolant. With lubricants, it typically is on a very scheduled basis. And should coolant be tested in a similar fashion?
Yeah, the general recommendation is you should sample your coolant as often as you sample your engine oil. The cost is about the same cost either way, oil compared to coolant tests. So it's not like it's really hard on your pocketbook. But if you're going to decide not to do your coolant testing as often, then of course it's recommended to only back off to half as often. So every other time you sample your oil, you should be sampling your coolant. And like I said, it just goes right back to the statistics that say about half of all engine problems are related to the coolant. So why would you want to miss that opportunity to catch a problem by, not taking an oil sample? So it is always a question people have, because of course, many people have never done coolant analysis and say, well, I've been fine with it for all these years. Why should I do it so aggressively now? And you go,
Right.
how do you know you've been fine? How do you know some of those problems you've had haven't been because something was going wrong on the coolant side and manifested itself finally on the oil side?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, the recommendation is as often as your oil.
Very good point. And then the last question that I received ahead of time, they were asking, this is someone who actually has watched one of your previous presentations, and you were describing the process for interpreting oil analysis reports. So they were wondering if the process for interpreting coolant data is similar.
It is very similar, yeah. Generally speaking, whatever you're going to see wrong with something like, say, pH or additives is generally attributed to something like a contaminant. So again, doing that cause and effect kind of way of reading the report and understanding that an additive is not necessarily the cause unless it's the wrong additive, like you were asking earlier, if it's mixing with the wrong coolant. But if it's the right additive and it's simply decreasing, well, that's just an effect. What's causing it to decrease? You'll probably find somewhere else in the report, usually in the contaminant section, like I said, identifying that something else is getting in there. And really, one of the most common contaminants to a cooling system is engine gas blowby. If you have a head gasket that's failing or a cracked head, you're going to get combustion gases in there. They will react with your additives. They will deplete them quite quickly. You will see your pH drop into the acidic range. All these kinds of things are all effects, and the cause ultimately is, something like a cracked head. So, the report reading format, style, whatever you want to call it, is very similar. Yep.
Perfect. All right, and let me check here. We don't have any other comments or questions at the moment. So with that, we will let everyone out early here. And if you do have any questions, you can find Evan's email address, my email address at the bottom of the screen here. Otherwise, our next live Q&A is going to be on August 30th at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And that one's going to be exciting. We're going to actually have a special guest with us, and we will be covering wireless vibration sensors. So that one's I'm looking forward to. Should be interesting as well. Evan, otherwise, thank you so much for your time, and it was great chatting with you today.
All right. Thanks, Heather.